I'm not actually sure how controversial or unpopular any of these opinions are, so, I guess I'll find out. Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to another one of my 11 videos. Today I'm sharing with you 11 of my unpopular bookish opinions. I think I may have shared some of these before in different videos in different ways, but never all 11 in one concentrated video of evil. I'm going to do that with you today. I'm going to come out of the gate strong by talking about my first unpopular bookish opinion, and that is that audiobooks, or listening to an audiobook, is not the same as reading. It's not. The two actions are different. Now, I know in saying that, a lot of people are automatically going to think that I'm saying somehow listening to an audiobook doesn't count as having read a book. If you watch my channel, you know I listen to audiobooks, and I count them. It counts. The act of listening and the act of reading are two different acts, but one of the things that bothers me about this whole issue surrounding audiobooks is the idea that somehow somebody saying listening to a book and reading a book are not the same thing is demeaning one or the other. Listening and reading are two different activities, but one's not less than the other. One's not inferior to the other. Me saying that listening to an audiobook, which again I'll point out I do every single month, that listening to an audiobook is not the same as reading it, doesn't mean that it's a lesser activity. I mean, to be honest with you, our storytelling tradition as human beings is exactly that, a storytelling tradition. Most of the stories, most of the plots that you and I kind of can identify as being present in most works of fiction came from stories that were told. Folk tales, traditional tales, even to a certain extent Shakespeare and the Greek plays, these were things that were performed, that were seen, that were heard, not read off the page, because literacy is a relatively modern thing in terms of being able to read. In terms of being able to read books, in terms of having books available. So when I say that listening to an audiobook is not the same as reading, I'm not demeaning listening to audiobooks. Listening to the book, you get access to the same information. You absorb the plot. You can identify you can identify the characters. You understand character development and the writing. All those kind of things can come from listening to an audiobook. So audiobooks are not lesser than reading a book. It's just a different activity. Unpopular bookish opinion number 2, 1984 is not a particularly good book. That's right, George Orwell's 1984, one of the foundational works of dystopian fiction, at least modern dystopian fiction, is not a particularly good book. I know the book has lots of important ideas that we still reference and talk about all the time. I'm not suggesting that 1984 doesn't have cultural significance. It certainly does, but the book itself isn't really that good. I mean, the book itself drags in places, and because it's a book which is trying to kind of explain and create a metaphor for society, or for society in the Soviet Union, it can belabor the point a great deal. The characters are not, to me, particularly, well developed. It's a book about an idea and not necessarily a particularly good book or a good novel. I've never liked it, never enjoyed reading it the 2 times I read it, and I just don't think it's a very good book. Unpopular opinion number 3, or unpopular bookish opinion number 3, 19th century French writers are superior to 19th century Russian writers. I know that most people on here most booktube people seem to favor Russian writers, Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, in particular Chekhov also. I've always struggled to get along with Russian writers and Russian books, and I usually blame it on the names, but to be honest with you, there's something else about it that I don't like. There's a heaviness, there's what I feel like is an almost self-imposed, overbearing seriousness about the books and about the writing style and the plotting of most Russian novels that I just don't care for. Whereas 19th century French writers like Balzac and Flaubert and Stendhal seem to cover many of the same things and many of the same ideas, but they do it in a way which is not, doesn't weigh you down, isn't necessarily depressing, can be more just straightforward entertaining while covering lots of the same ideas. So I just think 19th century French writers are superior to 19th century Russian writers. Unpopular bookish opinion number 4, and this is probably one that's not that controversial, but I don't think a character's name should symbolize anything. I do not like it when a character's name is symbolic of something, where the most obvious cases would be cases where it refers to, Jesus Christ. Now, despite that, Joe Christmas and Faulkner's Light in August is, that's one of my favorite books, and he's in there. But generally speaking, I don't like it when characters have these symbolic names. Number one, what if I don't get it? What if I don't pick up on the symbolism of the character's name? That then takes something away from the reading experience. And number two, being someone who has a hard time remembering characters' names, oftentimes the character's name just isn't something that sticks in my head that I think of as important. And so I don't like it when character names carry some kind of weight or symbolism. I just don't like that. Unpopular opinion number 5 is that literary fiction should not be considered a genre. Kieran over at KDreads did a video related to this, and I'll try to remember to leave a link to it down below. But I more or less agreed with everything he says. Now, having said that, I say literary fiction all the time on my channel. And I refer to literary fiction because, in some ways it is a shorthand for a kind of book, which I think Kieran focused on the idea that it's about an idea, that it has some kind of a message beyond the plot that it's trying to convey. And I think that's a pretty good description of it. I'm not sure there's a perfect description because, like I said, I don't think literary fiction should be considered a genre. To begin with, like I said, it's vague. Exactly what is and isn't literary fiction is unclear. I think the name in itself is snobby. I think it keeps people from reading great books because they think, oh, it's a work of literary fiction, that's going to be boring, or that's going to be too hard to read, or that's going to be something I don't understand. And I think it's off-putting to lots of people. And since we are talking about books that kind of center on ideas or maybe character development or maybe style a little bit more, there are no real tropes, there's no real formula, there's no real setup for literary fiction that I think makes it qualify as a genre. I would much prefer that we just refer to all works of fiction that are not clearly a part of a genre, like detective fiction or science fiction fantasy, that we refer to all of them as just fiction. I think that's a lot better, and then we don't have this unnecessary snobby barrier that may be, in fact, turning people off from reading some books that we think are just great. Number 6 is one that I see all the time on BookTube, and that is people saying that reading or reviewing books is subjective. This is not true. Reviewing the book isn't subjective. Reviewing the book can be objective, and I would argue that everybody reviews books objectively, meaning that they apply a set of standards to decide whether or not they think that book is good. Now, where the subjectivity comes in is in what that set of standards is. What does the individual reviewer think makes a book good, think makes a book bad, what cause them to give a book 5 stars? We all have, I'm going to use an education term, we all have a rubric in our head for what makes books good. It's not like this is something we're consciously thinking of all the time, but it is a kind of a list of things that we appreciate about a work of fiction, that we appreciate about a book that makes it good, that causes us to give it, I don't give star ratings, but some people do, give it 5 stars or 4 stars, or to say the book is great or makes the book a favorite of the year. And as long as we're applying our own subjectively created rubric, as long as we do that consistently, we are, in fact, reviewing objectively. We're reviewing objectively according to a set of standards that we have created. And this is really one of the great things about book reviews on BookTube, and I think about book reviews in general. As you get to know a reviewer, as you get to know somebody with a BookTube channel, and you listen to their reviews, you find the people whose rubric or whose idea of what makes a book a good book or not that are most similar to yours. And so you can go to those people and trust them as a resource, for books that you're probably going to like. By the same token, I can watch review videos of books from people who I know my taste doesn't match theirs and still enjoy them because I know the criteria, or at least I know from the past, what their criteria for rating a book is. And I think this is one of the great things about BookTube and about reviewing books, is finding those people whose opinion about books, whose rubric about books is similar to yours, and then being able to find books that you're relatively sure you're going to at least have a good chance of liking based on their reviews. Unpopular opinion number 7 is that checklist reading can be good. So what do I mean by checklist reading? I mean that is you making a conscious effort to read more books by this type of author. You make a conscious effort to read books by trans authors or by Asian authors or by Hispanic women authors, whatever it is. That kind of checklist reading oftentimes gets disparaged, and don't get me wrong, there's a danger in that as well. But I think as somebody who has been working throughout my time on BookTube to really diversify my reading more, I think one of the things the checklist reading, and that could include, like the themed reading months, one of the things the checklist reading can do for me, has done for me, is it's made reading diversely a habit. So that, yeah, I might have started off saying, okay, I'm going to read more books by black authors, and I do that. But eventually, once that happens, and I find that these are books that I really like, then I'm seeking out books by black authors without thinking about it. I'm seeking out to read more diversely without thinking about it, and the checklist can lead to that. Now, if checklist reading is all the diverse reading you're doing, if it's the only thing you're doing, you're making your checklist, say, okay, I read 5 books by Asian women authors this year, I don't have to read any more books by Asian women authors, then I think it's detrimental. But it can be a very good thing of building the habit of reading diversely, which I think is one of the great things that you can do as a reader. Unpopular book opinion number 8 is that there are very few racist books. Now, if you've watched my channel, you may be surprised at me saying that, but the truth of the matter is there are very few books that are racist. There are lots of racist authors, particularly in the past. The further back you go, the more common racism becomes as a feature in works of fiction. There are lots of racist authors. There are lots of books, particularly in the past and present, that contain racist language. And there are lots of books in which there are characters who are racist, who may or may not be viewed as the bad guy in the book. All these things are true, and if those are things that bother you, then you certainly don't have to read those books. But that isn't, to me, what makes a book racist. What makes a book racist is if the author's intent, in total or in part, is to convey a racist message, to have as one of their themes something that promotes racism. Okay, I'll use the example I use all the time because it's one of the very few actual racist books I can think of, and that is Gone with the Wind. Gone with the Wind is not necessarily about racism, but it promotes racism. Margaret Mitchell wrote it in the 1930s, and in the 1930s she wrote a book in which she, in her authorial voice, condoned lynching in cases in which a black man was accused of raping or being sexually inappropriate with a white woman. She wrote that at a time in which those kinds of lynchings were actually happening, and she justified that in Gone with the Wind. To me, that makes Gone with the Wind, and for other reasons, a racist book, but they are relatively uncommon. Again, I would say that doesn't mean I'm telling you shouldn't read Gone with the Wind. It means I'm giving you my opinion about Gone with the Wind. It doesn't mean that you have to accept that there was racism books in the past and you have to read those books anyway. You certainly don't. But I do think that the reality is that there are very few, comparatively speaking, actual racist books that promote racism. So unpopular opinion number 9 is that this whole idea of the death of the author is just BS. Very few of us really approach books as though the author doesn't exist. And the proof of that is when we talk about books, we hold the book up, we read the author's name, and we give a little information about the author. Suzette Mayer is a Canadian author. Well, why do I tell you she's Canadian before holding up a book? I tell you something about their experiences. And when we're trying to figure out, what a book means, we're looking for those underlying themes and ideas in books. Oftentimes, I think what we're really wondering is, what is the writer saying here? And if you're thinking, what is the writer saying here? Why did the writer include that? Why did the writer make that character that name? Then you are not ignoring the existence of the author. You are not reading the book as though there was no author. You're not reading the book as though the author's intent, the author's ideas, the author's biography don't matter. And I think that very few of us actually read that way at all. That for all of us, the author's biography matters. That we do care to a certain extent about the author's intent. Okay, which will kind of be reflected in the next two I have. Unpopular opinion number 10, authors should not write books that center on ethnic, racial, etc. communities that they are not a part of. Now, this is one of those things that people automatically say, why shouldn't a blank writer be able to write a book about blank people? You certainly can. I didn't say they should be forbidden. I said they should not. And the reason I think they should not has to do with that I don't believe in the death of the author thing. I believe that it's difficult to achieve the right level of authenticity if you are not a part of the group that you're writing about. Moreover, what I question is, why would, to give the most obvious example, why would a white author feel like they should write a book about a black character, the black community, the experience of being black in the United States of America or in Great Britain or wherever? Why do they feel like they should write that book? You know, why do they feel like that's the book they should write? And I have a tendency to believe that there's no good answer to that question of why. And the last of my unpopular bookish opinions, unpopular opinion number 11, is that difficult and obscure books are not better than books that are easy to understand. There's nothing about the difficulty of reading Ulysses or any other difficult or obscure book that makes it automatically better than a book that's easier to read. And I'll just stick with Joyce. Ulysses is not better than the stories in Dubliners. The stories in Dubliners are easier to read, they're easier to understand, they're much clearer. Do they have thematic sub-content? They certainly do. But are they easier to read? They are. But they are not inferior to Ulysses. Just because Ulysses is obscure, it contains thousands of cultural references specific to Dublin in 1916, doesn't make it a better book than Dubliners. Complexity, difficulty, obscurity, form, confusing form, stream of content, that doesn't make a book better. You having to sit and figure it out may be something that you find enjoyable, entertaining, and bless you. I like books like that too. But that doesn't automatically mean that book is better. And I think oftentimes what we do, booktube in real life, is we assume that the more difficult a book is to understand, or the more difficult a book is to read, the better that book must be, the more important work of literature that book must be. And to be honest with you, the older I get, the more I appreciate the ability to convey theme, message, characters, subtlety in plain, direct language. Anyway, there you go. There are my 11 unpopular bookish opinions. I look forward to seeing your comments in the comment section below, and as always, thank you for watching.